The cowboy's breath hung like a cloud in the cold, the wind gnawing at his skin. After 3 days in the saddle, his fingers were numb, his face frozen, but he had one trick left to keep him alive, and it was buried deep in his pack. Before we ride further, tell us where you're listening from, and if Frontier Tales speak to you, hitch your horse at the channel and stay for tomorrow's story. The wind cut across the plains, biting deep into the bones of the land. Jack Callahan had long grown accustomed to the harsh winds of the west, but this was different. The cold was creeping earlier than expected, a cruel reminder that winter had come to claim its own. On the morning of October 12th, he mounted his horse, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he adjusted his worn coat and scarf. The sun was still low, barely kissing the horizon, but there was little warmth to be found. The frost had already settled heavy on the ground, and the frost-bitten tips of his gloves felt as if they might snap off with the first heavy pull of the reins. Jack had ridden the open range for years, his only companion, the hum of the wind and the steady clop of hooves beneath him. He was no stranger to cold, but this morning's bite was sharper than most. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Amos, flicked its ears back in irritation, but Jack ignored the gesture. The animal had no say in the matter. They had a job to do. He had been sent from the southern ranches, a week's ride north, to deliver a crucial message to a fellow rancher. The snow hadn't begun falling yet, but the chill that gripped the land suggested it wasn't far behind. The journey would take him through miles of empty plains, rolling hills, and eventually the treacherous mountain passes where the wind never seemed to let up. The cold in the morning felt different, though. It wasn't the usual bite that one could ignore with the warmth of the day, but a sharp, punishing chill that whispered of things to come. Jack had never been the superstitious sort, but as the wind whipped his face, a gnawing feeling settled in his gut. The feeling was more than just the weather. It was the weight of the task ahead. At 32 years old, Jack had long grown accustomed to the solitude of the range. His life had been a quiet one, filled with the rhythm of cattle, the crackle of campfires, and the harsh beauty of the untamed frontier. The land had no room for anything but necessity, and Jack had learned to adapt. Still, it hadn't been an easy life, not by any stretch of the imagination. No life on the frontier ever was. As the trail ahead stretched endlessly into the horizon, the first of the snowflakes began to fall, light at first but quickening as the day wore on. Jack set his jaw, the cold beginning to creep through the layers of his coat and settle deep into his bones. He reached down and gripped the reins tighter, the leather of his gloves biting into his fingers. His hands felt stiff, the cold already finding its way under the edges of his gloves. But there was little time to dwell on the discomfort. He would ride through it, just as he always had. The wind howled louder now, pushing him forward with a sense of urgency. Jack shifted in his saddle, glancing at the trail ahead. No turning back now. The rancher was counting on him. The snow had begun to fall in earnest by the time Jack reached the foothills, the ground beneath his horse's hooves slick and treacherous. The wind, which had once been an annoying bite, was now a full force, biting into his skin with each gust. The snowflakes swirled in a chaotic dance around him, stinging his face and making it difficult to keep his eyes open. His breath, heavy from the exertion of the ride, formed thick clouds of mist in the air. Jack had grown used to the cold over the years, but this was different. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the relentless nature of the wind, the way it seemed to cut through every layer of clothing he wore. He glanced down at his boots, noticing the first signs of frostbite creeping at the edges of his toes. His fingers had started to feel numb too, despite the thick gloves. He was no stranger to this kind of weather, but this early onset of winter was more dangerous than he had anticipated. By the time noon rolled around, Jack was already feeling the toll of the elements. His hands were stiff, the fingers almost unresponsive as he struggled to grip the reins. The trail ahead grew steeper, and with the snow falling steadily now, the terrain was becoming harder to navigate. His horse Amos was clearly growing weary, its steps slower with each passing mile. Jack urged him forward, but even the sturdy animal was starting to show signs of exhaustion. The cold was seeping through his clothes now, no longer just a bite but a deep, gnawing ache in his bones. Jack could feel the stiffness in his joints, the way his legs protested with every shift in his saddle. The woolen coat he wore, though warm, was no match for the sharp wind. His mind kept returning to the promise he'd made to get the message to the northern rancher no matter what. But with each mile, that promise seemed harder to keep. Jack cursed under his breath, urging Amos up the next incline. He needed to make it to shelter before dark. A sudden thought crossed his mind. How far had he come already? He knew the distance was long, but he hadn't anticipated this kind of weather to make the journey feel so dangerous. He hadn't even brought enough supplies to ride out a storm like this. What had seemed like a simple delivery mission had turned into something far more serious. The ground beneath them grew slick with ice, and the wind howled louder, as if warning them to turn back. But Jack's pride would not let him stop. There was no turning back now. He just needed to make it through this storm. The snow fell thicker now, and Jack's world had shrunk to a blur of white. His horse, Amos, was slowing. His movements labored with the weight of the snow and the relentless wind. They had been riding for nearly 5 days, and the cold was beginning to take its toll. The frostbite was worse. Now his fingers ached, his feet felt as though they were slowly being swallowed by the cold, and his nose was raw, wind-burned red. Every part of him felt as if it were breaking under the pressure. The trail ahead was nearly invisible, swallowed by the storm. Jack glanced at the horse and sighed, the weight of their journey pressing down on him. Amos was struggling. But the horse wasn't the problem, Jack was. He had underestimated the severity of the cold and the distance. They had passed a few scattered cabins in the last few days, but none had been the shelter he had hoped for. They were either abandoned or too far off the trail. So now, as the wind howled through the trees, Jack made the decision to stop for a moment, seeking shelter behind a cluster of rocks. The wind was cutting, but the rocks provided some relief, and Jack dismounted stiffly, his body protesting with every move. His pack had been a mix of carefully chosen supplies, but there was one thing he hadn't anticipated using wool. He had packed it simply as a backup, but now it was all he had. His father had once told him that wool was the key to surviving the worst winters, but Jack had always thought of it as a bit old-fashioned. He had no choice now but to believe in it. Jack unwrapped the wool from his saddlebag, his frozen fingers fumbling with the rough cloth. He had enough to make a difference, enough to cover his hands, feet, and neck. He could feel the burn of the cold already creeping back into his legs and arms, but this wool might be the difference between life and death. The snow fell harder as he worked quickly, wrapping his hands in layers of wool. He cut a piece for his feet, tucking it tightly into his boots, making sure there were no gaps. He added a few layers to his neck and wrapped the remaining pieces around his gloves and scarf. The wool felt thick and comforting, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. As he finished, Jack stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had to keep moving. He had no choice. He swung back onto Amos, the wool providing a small but much-needed buffer against the cold. The wind picked up again, but now there was a new determination in Jack's heart. He was not beaten yet. He had what he needed if only he could push through the storm. The storm raged on, its fury unmatched by anything Jack had ever experienced in his years of traveling the frontier. The wind howled with an intensity that felt like a living thing, pushing against him as if determined to send him tumbling off the ridge. The snow, thick and relentless, settled on his shoulders and in his face, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of him. But Jack had learned long ago that the land demanded respect, and it could take as much as it gave. Survival meant listening, adapting, and making the most of what was available. The wool trick, simple though it may have seemed, was his ticket to enduring this storm. It was all he had left. As the hours passed, Jack could feel the wool working. His fingers, though still numb, no longer ached with the sharp pain of frostbite. His toes, wrapped in the thick fabric, had stopped burning and tingling. The wool didn't heat him. It insulated, trapped his body heat close, and prevented the cold from creeping deeper into his bones. For the first time since the storm began, Jack allowed himself to feel something like relief. The wind still bit at him, and the snow still fell in thick sheets, but the wool had created a barrier between him and the worst of it. He could keep moving, even if his body screamed at him to stop. Amos was slowing, his head hanging low as he trudged forward, barely able to lift his legs from the snow. Jack nudged him gently with his heels, coaxing the horse forward. He had to make it through this. They had come so far, and the rancher was counting on him. But the path ahead was still treacherous, winding through narrow ravines and steep hills that could become deadly in an instant. The idea of stopping was tempting, of finding some shelter to wait out the storm, but Jack knew he couldn't afford the time. He couldn't afford to rest when the rancher's livelihood depended on the message he carried. His mind flashed back to the warmth of the rancher's home, to the promise of shelter and a bed after this long ride. But it was still days away. So he kept riding, the cold seeping in again with every gust of wind. The wool worked, but it wasn't a cure-all. It was only a barrier, something to give him a fighting chance. Every now and then, he reached down to adjust the wool around his boots, making sure it stayed in place. The simplicity of it struck him. A simple trick, one his father had used and taught him all those years ago. A trick that was now keeping him alive. As Jack rode, the storm grew fiercer, but he no longer felt as though he were losing ground. He had the wool to thank for that. The storm had become something more than Jack had bargained for. The wind roared across the land, a force so cold and unforgiving that it seemed to slice through every part of him. The snow fell in sheets now, the visibility reduced to nearly nothing, with only the faint silhouette of Amos's head visible in the whiteout. Jack had ridden through countless storms before, but this felt different. It felt like something that could swallow him whole if he wasn't careful. The wool had held for now a small comfort in the face of such unrelenting cold. His fingers, stiff and aching, still felt the effects of the frostbite, but the wool had allowed some circulation to return. It was the only thing keeping him going, a threadbare lifeline in an ocean of snow and wind. He urged Amos forward, but the horse's steps were slow now, dragging through the snow with every movement. The cold was working its way up Jack's legs, and he could feel the wool around his feet becoming damp from the snow that had seeped through. His mind, focused on nothing but survival, told him he had to keep moving. He had no choice but to press on. But as the storm intensified, Jack began to question his decision. He was no longer sure he could make it to the ranch. The snow was drifting, and the trail had disappeared under a thick blanket of white. Every direction looked the same, endless, featureless plains that stretched to the horizon. The horse had started to stumble, its hooves finding no purchase in the deep snow. Jack knew he couldn't afford to let Amos fall. If they didn't make it to shelter soon, they might both freeze. He looked around desperately, scanning the landscape for any sign of refuge, any landmark that might offer shelter. But there was nothing. Just the wind, the snow, and the oppressive silence that filled the void between the gusts. The storm had taken everything from him, his strength, his focus, and now his sense of direction. Jack felt the sting of panic creeping up on him. This storm wasn't just an obstacle, it was a threat. It could kill him if he wasn't careful. His breath came faster now, the tightness in his chest increasing as he realized just how vulnerable they were. But then, through the whiteout, he saw something. A faint outline in the distance, barely visible against the swirling snow. Jack squinted, his eyes watering from the cold, but he was sure of what he saw. It was a ridge, something solid, something to shelter behind. His heart skipped. He kicked Amos forward, urging the horse into a last burst of speed. The wind whipped past them as they moved toward the ridge, the snow clinging to his clothes. The wool trick, for all its worth, wasn't enough to keep him safe from the storm, but the ridge just maybe would be. With every step, he felt the storm close in around them, but he pressed on, knowing that survival was no longer about fighting nature, it was about finding shelter from it. The ridge loomed closer with each agonizing step, the dark outline growing more defined against the white fury of the storm. Jack's heart raced as he spurred Amos forward, urging the exhausted horse to keep going. The wind cut through him, the wool no longer enough to fully block the relentless bite of the cold. Jack's body was stiff with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. The ridge ahead was their only hope for shelter before the storm claimed them completely. Amos's hooves crunched through the snow, each step more labored than the last. Jack could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on him, but his mind was singular in its focus. He had to get to the ridge. He had to find shelter before the storm finished what it started. The snow swirled violently around them, and Jack's vision was limited to just a few feet ahead. His face stung from the cold, his lips cracked, but he pressed on. Every time Amos's steps slowed, Jack kicked him harder, his spurs biting into the horse's flanks. They were close, he could feel it. If he could just make it another few hundred yards, they'd reach the ridge, and there he could find cover. His breath was ragged now, and he could feel the frost building on his mustache and eyebrows, the moisture in the air freezing against him. The wool had held up, but there was only so much it could do. His toes were numb, and his fingers were stiff, the cold creeping further into his body with every passing minute. The urgency grew, pulsing in his chest like a drumbeat, each thud a reminder that they were running out of time. Amos stumbled again, and this time Jack couldn't stop the horse from nearly collapsing into the snow. The beast's legs were trembling with the strain, and Jack knew they couldn't go on much longer like this. He patted Amos's neck, trying to offer some comfort, though he knew the horse was beyond exhausted. "Come on, Amos, just a little further." The horse snorted and tried to rise, but its legs buckled again. Jack's heart sank. His own legs were near to giving out too, but he had to keep moving. Slowly, he slid off Amos's back, his body stiff from the cold. He grasped the reins and pulled the horse upright, urging him on with soft words and a determined tug. They moved again, the distance to the ridge shrinking with every step. The wind was deafening now, a constant roar that threatened to push them both off their feet. The snow seemed to close in around them, thick and blinding, but Jack kept his eyes locked on the ridge. It was the only thing keeping him going, the only thing that promised shelter, even if it was nothing more than a small break in the mountain's curve. As the final stretch unfolded before them, Jack dared to believe they might make it. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. The ridge offered little more than a slight overhang, but it was enough, just enough to offer a brief respite from the storm. Jack reached the edge, guiding Amos beneath the rocky outcrop where the snow had not yet piled high. The wind still howled, but the shelter of the rock provided a slight reprieve. The cold still gnawed at him, but here, at least, he could catch his breath. Jack staggered forward, his legs stiff from the long ride. The relief of reaching the shelter was almost overwhelming, but it came with a price. His body screamed for rest, the deep exhaustion threatening to take him all at once. He had only one thought: to keep moving, to stay alive. Amos, too, seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. The horse, though worn out, stepped carefully under the rock's edge, his hooves scraping against the frozen earth. Jack led him to the far side of the outcrop, where he could tether the animal securely. He removed the reins, his hands still clumsy from the cold, and then leaned against the stone, taking a moment to gather himself. The wind did not let up, but here, in the shelter of the rocks, the worst of it seemed to pass by, howling over the top rather than attacking from all sides. Jack's heart rate slowed, and he took a deep breath, letting the temporary stillness calm his nerves. It wasn't much, but it was enough to gather his thoughts. Jack's eyes flickered toward his horse. Amos was still standing, but the animal's breathing was shallow, each exhale visible in the frigid air. Jack could see the exhaustion in the horse's eyes. He patted the gelding's neck gently, offering what comfort he could. The horse had carried him through so much, and now it was Jack's turn to return the favor. He worked quickly, adjusting the saddle to ensure that the cold didn't reach the horse's body, and he rummaged through his supplies to find what he could. The wool trick had worked better than he'd dared hope, but it wasn't enough to stave off the full toll of the storm. Jack's feet, though no longer burning with frostbite, were stiff with the cold, and his fingers refused to move without a sharp, painful protest. But the wool had provided him with something he hadn't realized he needed most: a flicker of hope. It had allowed him to keep moving, to keep fighting against the storm's grasp, one step at a time. As Jack took a moment to check the layers of wool on his hands and feet, he allowed himself a small, fleeting thought of warmth. The ranch was still far, but he had made it this far. He hadn't given up. And as the storm continued its assault on the world around him, that small victory holding on meant everything. His mind began to turn toward the next step. The ranch was still ahead. He could not afford to stop here for long. The wind had lost none of its fury, but the ridge had granted Jack and Amos a brief respite. For the first time in days, Jack allowed himself a moment of stillness, the kind of quiet that made it possible to hear his own heartbeat. But the peace was short-lived. The ranch, and the message Jack carried, was still a long ride away. And with the storm still raging, there was no more time to waste. Jack adjusted his wool layers one last time, pulling the thick fabric tighter around his feet and hands. His legs ached with every movement, his joints stiff from hours in the saddle, but there was no turning back. He couldn't afford to rest any longer. If he stayed much longer on the ridge, the storm would catch up with them. They had to keep moving. "Come on, Amos," Jack muttered, more to himself than to the horse. He reached out and gave the gelding a gentle pat on the neck, but the horse's tired eyes gave away his exhaustion. The animal had pushed through as much as he could, but they both knew the next part of the journey would be the hardest yet. With one last glance at the rocky overhang that had provided them with shelter, Jack urged Amos forward. The horse stumbled slightly as he found his footing, but Jack kept his grip on the reins steady, leading him down the snowy slope. The storm still whipped at them with unrelenting force, the snow now so thick that even the rocky ground beneath their feet seemed to blur into a sea of white. The only sounds were the harsh wind and the dull thud of Amos's hooves as they sank deeper into the snow. Jack kept his focus ahead, forcing his mind to shut out the biting cold and the overwhelming exhaustion. He had learned long ago that survival was not about how you felt, it was about doing what needed to be done. And right now, that meant getting to the ranch. He had no other choice. The wool trick had done its job for the moment, but it wasn't a permanent solution. Jack could feel the frost creeping in again, the numbness returning to his hands and feet. But he kept moving, his mind locked on the goal. The ranch was still ahead. He could see it now, faint in the distance, barely visible, through the veil of snow. It wasn't much, just a sliver of hope on an otherwise bleak horizon. His heart quickened at the sight, a surge of adrenaline pushing him forward. They were close now, so close. The land was open, the trail ahead more visible with each step, but the storm was still fierce. There was no time to think of anything but the next mile, the next step. Jack focused on Amos's steady rhythm beneath him, feeling the horse's strength give him strength, even as the storm seemed to press harder against them. They would make it. He just had to believe it. The ranch house appeared through the snowstorm like a ghost, its wooden frame barely visible against the whiteout. Jack's heart surged as he spotted the faint outlines of the structure. But it wasn't just the promise of warmth that kept him moving forward, it was the feeling of finally having made it. A small, fleeting sense of triumph, but enough to push him through the final stretch. Amos was still moving, but with each step it became clearer how much more strain the horse had endured. His legs trembled, and Jack could see the weight of exhaustion in the animal's eyes. The storm had pushed them both past their limits, but they were almost there, just a short distance from shelter. Jack, too, felt the crushing weight of fatigue. His legs were stiff, and the cold was creeping back into his body, no longer held at bay by the wool trick. The numbness in his hands was spreading, but he focused on the house ahead, forcing himself to ignore the pain that clawed at him. There would be time for rest once they were inside. For now, it was all about reaching the ranch and delivering the message that had been his sole purpose for this long ride. The closer they got, the more Jack's mind began to wander, his thoughts drifting back to the storm and everything that had brought him to this moment. The wool trick had saved him, but it had also taught him something deeper, that in the wilderness it was the small things, the simplest tools, that made all the difference. He hadn't needed the finest clothes, the best weapons, or even the largest pack. All he had needed was that bit of wool, a small bit of knowledge passed down from his father. It had been enough to keep him alive, to give him a fighting chance. And yet, as Jack thought back on his journey, he realized it hadn't just been the wool that had kept him going. It was the lessons learned on the trail, the quiet confidence that grew with each passing hour, each mile. He had been tested, and in that testing he had learned something vital. Survival was not just about fighting the land or the weather. It was about making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. It was about trusting his instincts, even when everyone else doubted him. The ranch house loomed closer now, its windows faintly glowing from within, offering a promise of warmth and refuge. Jack urged Amos forward with a quiet command, giving the horse the last nudge of encouragement it needed to close the distance. As he reached the door of the ranch, Jack slid from the saddle, his muscles aching, his body numb from the cold. He staggered slightly, but the ranch door opened before he could knock, and the warmth inside hit him like a wave. He could barely speak as he entered, but when the rancher saw him, he simply nodded and gestured to a chair by the fire. No words were needed. The storm had stripped away the need for explanations. Here, in the warmth, Jack realized that survival was about more than reaching the destination. It was about the journey itself and the lessons learned along the way. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, the flames dancing in the small ranch house as Jack eased into the chair by the fire. His body felt like it was made of stone, heavy, stiff, and worn from the long journey. He could barely feel his fingers anymore, but the warmth from the fire was slowly bringing life back to his numb hands and feet. Amos had been taken into the barn, and Jack's eyes followed the flicker of shadows as the rancher moved around the room, tending to the hearth. It had been a long ride, but in the end, Jack had made it, not just by the skin of his teeth, but by sheer stubbornness and the old wool trick. It had been the kind of simple solution Jack had laughed at when his father had first taught him about the ways of the land, about how wool could make the difference in the harshest winters. At the time, it had seemed like just another one of his father's old-fashioned remedies. But now, here in the warmth of the ranch house, Jack understood. Survival didn't come from complicated plans or fancy tricks. It came from knowing the land, from understanding the tools at your disposal, and from making the right decisions when it counted most. The wool had kept him alive, kept him going even when the storm had seemed like it might swallow him whole. His father's advice had been simple but profound. Use what you have, and always prepare for the worst. Jack watched as the rancher placed a mug of hot coffee in front of him. The warmth from the cup seeped through his cold fingers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to relax. He had made it. Not without struggle, not without pain, but he had endured. The rancher, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, looked down at Jack with a knowing smile. "You look like you've been through hell, but I'll tell you this, son," the rancher said, his voice gravelly but kind. "You're one of the few who made it through this storm. I saw a lot of folks out there, and most didn't even make it half the distance you did. But you look like you came out the other side." Jack took a sip of the hot coffee, the warmth finally starting to settle into his bones. He looked up at the rancher, his lips curled into a tired smile. "I guess it's not always the biggest thing that saves you. Sometimes it's the little things you don't think about." The rancher raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What do you mean?" Jack chuckled softly, the sound barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "My father always told me, a man can survive a lot if he's got wool and a steady hand. I never believed him. But now I know exactly what he meant. It wasn't the fancy gear or the weapons, it was just wool. That little trick saved me." The rancher leaned back, a slow grin crossing his face, as he understood. The simple things just like that wool trick were what kept men alive out here. The frontier demanded a different kind of wisdom, the kind that didn't need to be complicated, it just needed to be practical. As the warmth of the fire seeped deeper into Jack's bones, he realized that this was the real victory. It wasn't just about surviving the storm, it was about the lesson it had taught him that sometimes the smallest, simplest solutions were the ones that mattered the most. And for Jack Callahan, that lesson would stay with him long after he left the warmth of this ranch house.